Welcome to the first in this year's Lent Conversations, which has the title of Facets of Violence and Paths to Peace. Our guest speaker this evening is the Reverend Dr. Helen Paynter. Helen is a Baptist minister who now works as tutor in biblical studies at the Bristol Baptist College. She is the founding director of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence. She has written extensively on these themes, including Blessed Are the Peacemakers, a biblical theology of human violence, The Bible Doesn't Tell Me So, Why You Don't Have to Submit to Domestic Abuse and Coercive Control, and also this book that I am reading at the present moment, The Bible, the Far Right, and the Claim to Christianity, which is co-edited with Maria Power. So this is going to be an excellent and a challenging series. And Helen, we start off with your input. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Am I on? Yeah. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation to, so I'm just hooking myself up, for the invitation to come and share I'm going to stand here actually, to come and share this first session with you. You've got some august speakers lined up. I feel very privileged to be invited to kick things off with you. So let me just tell you what we're going to do. We're going to have two shortish presentations with a 5-minute kind of opportunity for buzzing in the middle, and then another bit of buzz time at the end, and then we'll have some extended discussion after that. Is that okay? So that's my plan. Let me just get my clicker a second. I'll just say something, just a little biographical note, just to explain how I got into this, because people sometimes say to me, Helen, how long have you been doing violence? And I say, could you rephrase that, please? And now I've got, because I'm doing this work on the right-wing extremism, I've got the latest thing is, I say to my husband, I'm off, I've got a far-right meeting. I mean, I've got a... So I walk a tightrope. I have a medical background. I was called to Christian ministry about, 18 years ago now or something like that. And I've worked as a pastor in a couple of churches. I'm an Old Testament scholar by training. That's what my PhD is in. And I'm interested in biblical violence, interpretation of biblical violence. And that's what made me set up this study centre. But as I got into that more and more, I started becoming increasingly aware of the ways that scripture becomes entailed in contemporary situations of violence. And so hence work we've done around domestic abuse and right-wing extremism and a variety of other things. So that's the sort of world that I swim in. That's the sort of thing I spend a lot of my time thinking about. I want to introduce you to a few of these ideas this evening. I guess to perhaps set some framing for the conversations that you're going to be having over the next 6 weeks. So I hope that this will be useful. So in the first few minutes then, I want to offer some ideas from contemporary theorists of violence where people who are working in areas of psychology and sociology and politics and a range of other subjects are offering their own thoughts about what sparks and triggers and promotes human violence. So I'm going to offer those to you broadly without theological comment in the first instance, and then just before we break for our first buzz group, I'm going to bring that in and interrogate that in the light of scripture for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to invite you to continue that conversation. So we should probably start with a definition of violence. This is the definition that I use in my book. I mean, everybody who writes on this subject feels they have to define it. So there's as many definitions of violence as there are people writing on it. But here's one that kind of works, I think. Violence is the use of force or coercion in a way that causes harm to another. And let me just break that down a little bit for you. So when I say the use of force and coercion, that implies intentionality, but it doesn't necessarily imply an individual who is using force or coercion. Violence can be done by systems and by groups of any size, right up to the nation state, of course, as well as by individuals. And we need to have a definition of violence that is broad enough to incorporate the full range. Force or coercion. So violence doesn't always look physical. Violence doesn't always leave someone who is bruised or bleeding or dead. You will know, go back to what I said briefly about domestic abuse earlier and the work I've done in that. You're going to be having a session with the marvellous Becca Legg in a couple of weeks' time. Do make sure you come along and hear her. But it's interesting, we used to speak about domestic violence, and these days we tend to speak about domestic abuse because things have broadened, and the understanding of what happens that is harmful in abusive homes now includes coercive control as well as physical harm. So I would want to draw that sort of coercion under the definition within this banner. And then in a way that causes harm. And as I've already said, that may not be physical harm. It might be visible or invisible, and it includes severe emotional harm, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. I'm interested in human violence. So I'm not particularly going to be speaking this evening about violence against animals or violence against the climate, which isn't to say that those things don't matter, because of course they do, but I can't do everything. So this is a question that I'd like us to consider for just a couple of minutes. What drives human violence? And a secondary question related to that is whether violence is hardwired into the human condition. Well, let me introduce you to three theorists who worked in this area, and you may well know some of these names. So Zygmunt Bauman, who if I remember correctly, actually, sorry, I meant to look up his biographical details. He fled Hitler, and I think, if I remember correctly, he actually committed suicide in order to escape. No, that was Walter Benjamin. I beg your pardon. Zygmunt Bauman fled Hitler, came to the States and worked there. Sorry. Hannah Arendt also. She was actually arrested in the very early days of National Socialism. She's Jewish. They're both Jewish. And she then managed to, once she was released from prison in about 1932-33, she then managed to get out of Germany. And so she then was able to commentate on it from a safe distance. Christopher Browning, a slightly more contemporary scholar. And Browning did work looking at people who had been involved in atrocities during the Third Reich. And I'll tell you a little bit about his work in just a moment. Let's start with Bauman and what he says as he examines the violence, the appalling state violence and individual violence that broke out in Germany from 1932 onwards. And he says, when he looks back on the Holocaust, he says, we need to understand that this was not abnormal. What was abnormal was the fact that it was allowed to get to such a state, to such a structural acceptance, but that actually this violence is not an aberration, and that any society has the capacity to move in that direction. It's very reassuring for us to look at situations of appalling violence and say that's a dreadful aberration, and that could never happen here. And I'm guessing that even maybe the last 6 months or so has led us to a little more anxiety about the possibility that we are capable as a society, and our brothers and sisters across the Atlantic are capable, perhaps, as a society, of something far more dangerous than we have perhaps credited ourselves with previously. So that was Bauman's kind of big contribution in this area. Hannah Arendt has an interesting story, just a little bit of her story. But so she was sent to Jerusalem to cover, for a newspaper, to cover the trial of Eichmann. And some of you will know this story. And she covered the trial. And Eichmann, as you may well know, he was a senior official in the Nazi regime. And she looked at this man during the course of his trial, and she coined the term the banality of evil. Because she looked at this man and she said he was just a petty bureaucrat. I wanted to see a monster. I expected to see a monster. And I just saw a man who did his job well. And she was absolutely not. She was criticised for that because she was accused of underplaying the evil that he contributed to and that he committed. And she absolutely wasn't saying that. But she's saying, look how ordinary and routine evil can be. And Eichmann just played his little part. He was responsible for making the trains run on time. Sounds neutral enough, doesn't it? Of course, we know that those trains, many of them were going to the death camps. But his responsibility was for the timetabling and making sure that the infrastructure, the rolling stock, continued. And so this she referred to as the banality of evil. And then Christopher Browning did some work looking at, or really listening in on conversations in cells with a particular militarised police battalion who were arrested after the war. The survivors were arrested after the war because they had been involved in the very earliest moves of the Holocaust. Before the gas chambers were built, before the death camps really got going, they were involved in face-to-face murder in the thousands. And this was these men were not crack troops, and they weren't the SS, and they weren't even deeply ideological. But these men, most of them, some of them did choose to be reassigned to other tasks. But the majority of those men in that battalion, they were ordinary people, they were butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, and the majority of them got on with the unpleasant task of face-to-face murder in the thousands. And so Browning studies these men and says, what on earth could have brought them to this pass? And he looks and he breaks it down, and he says, what I see the sense that authorization gave them permission, that routinization, that breaking it up into small pieces, a bit like the Eichmann thing again, enabled them to participate, and the dehumanization of the other was able to release the violence within them. And Browning finishes the book with some chilling words, because he says, if that group of ordinary men could be brought to commit those appalling atrocities, what group of ordinary men could not be brought to do such a thing? So there's three theorists who have broadly similar ideas from a range of perspectives. They say violence is normal within society, or at least we are all capable of it. Okay, moving on. Hold that thought, because we'll pick it up again in a minute. Moving on then. This man is Dr. James Gilligan. And Gilligan works or worked as a psychiatrist in a very high security prison in the States, a man's prison in the States. And he was working with the most violent of offenders. And he's a psychiatrist, so he was doing, spending time talking with these men, listening to them and studying them. And he wrote a book outlining his findings. And his findings were, and so here we're speaking about interpersonal violence, about, somebody committing murder, somebody committing some sort of physical atrocity, one-on-one, if you like. And he says that the common factor which he saw in every single case of extreme violence that he was studying was the role of deep shame. And he said, these men, he says they describe themselves in non-metaphorical terms as already dead. They see themselves as already dead and physically just going through the motions of eating and breathing and excreting and so on, but actually they view themselves as already dead. Interestingly, just a side note, he says this shows the futility of capital punishment as a deterrent, because these people see themselves as dead, and many of them would actually welcome physical death to bring to a conclusion the living death that they are enduring. And part of this shame involves the absence or the deficiency of self-love, horror of dependency, systems of humiliation. Most of these men had traumatic experiences, abusive and experiences in their childhood or their youth, from which they carried enormous and enduring shame. And Gilligan, as far as I know, is not a Christian. He's certainly not a theologian. But he says something very interesting. So you'll be familiar with the expression, the death of God, I think. And what we mean by the death of God when we refer to it is not that the actual God is actually dead, but that belief in God has died in society. So that's what he means here. And he says this: the death of God is such a tragedy, not because we no longer have anyone to uphold the moral law. He says we're quite capable of doing that, but because we now have no one who is capable of forgiving us. It's a very significant statement, I think, that he makes, quite a theological statement that he makes out of his research and out of this experience or his findings of the prevalence of shame. Now, I've said already that he worked in a male high security institution, so we don't know if this transfers to violent female offenders, but I'll have to say there are far fewer violent female offenders. That study hasn't been replicated, as far as I know, in women's prisons. But nonetheless, I think it deserves taking seriously as one of the great drivers of interpersonal violence. Certainly, that's what he says. And then I want to show you some work by this man, René Girard. So Girard worked in France. He's an anthropologist, and he observed a pattern which he thinks is universal. He thinks it is found in every society. And opinions vary about whether he's right or not. I think there's a lot of explanatory power in what he articulates, even if maybe he's a bit reductive. You know what it's like if you've got to hammer everything that looks like a nail? Well, Girard is as susceptible to that as the next person. But nonetheless, he says what I think are some quite interesting and significant things. So, if you have had toddlers or if you have worked with toddlers, you will know this experience. Children happily playing in the creche room. Toddler A picks up a red tractor, and toddler B, who had no interest in that red tractor 30 seconds ago, now wants it with every fibre of his being. You're familiar with that? Yeah. Now, that is what Girard would call mimetic rivalry. And Girard says that our desires are mediated to us by other people's desires. So as soon as I see that somebody else finds something desirable, it becomes desirable to me as well. And so we come to imitate, mimesis simply means imitation really, we come to imitate one another in our desires. And again, as an aside, I would say that the entire advertising industry is based on that. And that what happens, he says, and obviously he's not really working on toddlers, he's working on grown men and women, and actually grown men. He doesn't do much with women, does Girard, and societies as a whole. He says that as the rivalry intensifies, that the two parties now start to imitate one another in their violence as well. And so actually what you get is you get this kind of escalation where, you know, A imitates B and then B kind of escalates it slightly, and then and so it kind of steps upwards, but it's imitative all the way up. There was a absolutely classic moment during the first Trump presidency where we saw this, where he got into a bit of a social media spat with Kim I always get the Korean leaders mixed up, the current Korean leader, and he said, I think the Korean leader said something like, "I've got a red button on my desk." And Trump said, "Yeah, but I've got a bigger red button," and it worked. I mean, A, they sound like toddlers, but B, actually what they were demonstrating was Girard in practice. Now, what Girard says will happen is, unless those two parties can find some way of expending their violence, then society will break down. They will expend their violence on one another, and they will enter open conflict. And so and that's called the crisis. And so what tends to happen is they tend to find a scapegoat. And a scapegoat can be an individual or it can be a group. And the scapegoat, the characteristics of the scapegoat are they are almost us, but they've got something that marks them out. And it might be that they have a disability. It might be that they are from a different ethnic group. It might be that they are from a different religion. And we will all know, for example, that scapegoating of the Jews has been something that has happened through the centuries. They're by no means the only group that have experienced it, but they most certainly have experienced it. And the key, and then what happens is the two parties expend their violence upon the scapegoat in one way or another. And kind of, although he doesn't talk in psychological terms, really what he's saying is that the two parties have kind of expended their violence, and now everything can simmer down a bit. not for the scapegoat, but for the two warring parties. But this only works if they really genuinely believe that the scapegoat is at fault. And so this is the great lie at the heart of the scapegoating mechanism, which Revd speaks about. And it doesn't work if they know at the back of deep in their hearts that the scapegoat is innocent. Then that it doesn't work, this mechanism. And so he, as a consequence, has some really interesting reflections on what's happening at the cross, which I'm not going to go into today because that's not really my topic for today. But he has some interesting reflections on the cross as a consequence. So there's kind of three big ideas that I would like to just remind you of. The question of kind of the normality of violence, the question of shame driving violence, and Revd's contribution, particularly in the sense of disordered desire, that what lies at the heart of it is disordered desire. So, for just 2 or 3 minutes before I invite you to break into buzz groups, let's reflect on those things theologically. And of course we could look at this all the way through Scripture, but quite frankly, when I'm teaching Old Testament to my undergraduates, it takes me 3 weeks to get out of Genesis 1 to 3. You're going to be lucky to get only 5 minutes on it. Okay, so let's talk about the normality of violence. Now, I'm going to invite you in a minute to reflect on other places in Scripture that might speak to that question, and I think Jesus speaks to that question. And perhaps we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But what I would like to suggest we learn from Genesis 1, 2 and 3 is that violence comes in very, very early after the fall, as Genesis tells the story, but it does not predate the fall, does not precede it. Now that might sound obvious, but as I'm sure you may well know, Genesis is written in a world where every culture has its own creation story. And all of the other creation stories in existence in the world of the writer of Genesis, they have a number of things in common. And what they have in common, they believe in a pantheism, they have a multiplicity of gods. And the earth is created as a byproduct of violence. So the gods are warring, or there's a great monster that they need to slay. And then out of that great cosmic battle, the earth is created. The other thing that many of those creation stories have is they have humanity being created as a slave for the gods. Now, one of the ways that we need to study those accounts in Genesis, this is why it takes me 3 weeks to get out of it with my students, is because we need to notice what it is saying in distinction to the prevailing current. And it is very distinct in the fact that, first of all, there is only one God. Secondly, that humanity is not created as a slave, but created as a kind of a wonderful guest within this hospitable space, this beautiful hospitable space that God has created for humanity. But perhaps for our purposes, the most significant thing is that the world is not created out of violence. That the world is created by this calm divine fiat, this calm, gentle word of command. And that is very substantially different from all of the other creation stories. And our writer is wanting us to draw our attention to this. He's wanting to say to us, well, I think what he's saying essentially in regard to the question of violence is not woven into the fabric of the universe. Violence is an aberration that comes in later, but it is not part of the grand design. And that is something that all of his contemporaries in the pagan cultures around, they would all say something different. They would say violence is woven into the fabric of the universe. And the writer of Genesis says no, it isn't. So that's one reflection on the question of the normality of violence. Let's think about the question of disordered desire, which I absolutely think we see at play in Genesis 3. I think there, it's quite interesting to reflect on, as Genesis 3 tells the story, what is the very first sin? And I don't think the very first sin, I mean, you could work backwards, couldn't you? There's the kind of lying to God, and we could go back a bit from that. And then there's the taking of the fruit. We could go back a bit from that. But then we come back to, listening to the serpent and seeing that the fruit is desirable. And Genesis explicitly uses the language of desire. And I think that the primal sin, as Genesis 3 tells the story, is disordered desire. And that Adam and Eve have a responsibility to desire certain things, and they turn their gaze and they desire things that they should not. So I suggest, and in case you're thinking, well, okay, that might explain the fall, but how does that relate to violence directly? What we see actually, as soon as the chapter closes in Genesis 3, our writer starts demonstrating to us how the world is now unraveling as a consequence of those choices. And really the theme that the writer picks on and most uses is the theme of violence, because of course we have Cain and Abel in the next chapter. And we have Lamech in, I think it's that same chapter, Lamech, who is already a polygamist. So structural violence has come in already at this point. And he boasts to his wives that he has repaid a man who harmed him 77-fold. So already we have this multiplicity of violence. And incidentally, when Jesus says forgive 77 times, I think he is referring back to that very first primal act of vengeance. So I think we see disordered desire within the Genesis account. I think we see shame within the Genesis account. We know that the first instinct of humanity, as they realise that they have infringed what they weren't permitted to do, is to realise their nakedness, to seek to clothe themselves. But more than that, and that's very significant, of course. But more than that, there's the blaming of one another, the seeking to stand behind one another. And I think if you look at then the first murder, I think we see shame at work there. You remember that Cain and Abel both bring an offering. This is Genesis 4. Both bring an offering, and for some inscrutable reason, God accepts Abel's, but doesn't accept Cain's. The writer doesn't tell us why. He's not going to let us off the hook there. He's just going to leave that hanging. But I think it is shame. It is a sense of loss of honour for Cain, which probably drives that first murder. And then scapegoating. Perhaps I shouldn't have put scapegoating on this slide. I'm not convinced we see scapegoating in Genesis 1 to 3, but because in Girard's pattern, scapegoating follows disordered desire, perhaps we see the roots of it. So that was a very quick whiz through some of the key theories of violence which are around at the moment, and how I think, or just touching on how I think we see them starting to be unfolded for us in the primordial accounts. So I'd like to invite you to take 5 minutes just to discuss with people around you some of these questions. So thinking about the normality of violence, the role of shame in violence, and the role of desire and mimesis in violence. That's the three ideas that I presented to you. Where have you seen evidence of these things at work, either in the news or in history or in perhaps more closer to home, but obviously nobody needs to share anything you don't want to. And secondly, and please don't spend all your time on the first question, because I want to ask, what does the gospel have to say to people who are trapped in shame or disordered desire? And we will I'm not going to take responses at this stage, but we'll pick this up in the conversation later. But perhaps you could get started on thinking about those things now. 5 minutes, is that okay? Park your thoughts if you're happy to. Put a pin in them, because we will, want to pick those up. I don't want to leave them there. But I'm going to move on with your permission and offer some thoughts about how we might resist violence. Thinking partly about how we might operate as forces that resist violence within a violent world, but also if you are persuaded by the argument that the root seeds of violence are within us all, then how can we address those? Sorry, you can't hear me?
David's gone. David's in the cupboard.
Is that better?
You might have lost it.
Is that apparently I'm not?
You're right. I'll turn you up.
Thank you. I can stand there if that's better. But you think so? Just.
Turn you up, it should be fine.
Okay. Thank you. I'll speak up as well. Is that better? Okay. Give me a wave if you lose me again. So some thoughts about how we might resist violence. So just a very brief comment about my book, Blessed are the Peacemakers. And I was asked to write this. It was to a particular pattern because the publisher had a series. And the first part was called Queuing the Questions, then the bulky middle part optimistically called Arriving at Answers, which I would not have used that of myself, but was basically a biblical survey of the question of violence. And then the final section called Reflecting on Relevance, trying to land this in the real world. But I basically spent years doing this kind of deep dive into scriptural testimony on violence, and I'm pleased I did, and I definitely learned a lot from doing it. But in the end, I thought there's three other testimonies, three other trajectories within Scripture, which kind of flow in and out of the question of violence, but that are slightly distinct and which are very, very relevant for this question. And they are justice, peace, and holiness. And so I would suggest, and I don't think this is controversial, that are you familiar with the term eschaton, eschatology? It relates to the end times, relates to the new heavens and the new earth. So I would suggest that the Scripture teaches there are three eschatological goals, three things that in the eschaton, in the new heavens and the new earth, we will realise completely. And that is justice, peace, and holiness. And therefore, in this time that is not yet the eschaton, we are called to the virtues of pursuing justice, living peaceably, and, moral purity or integrity, or I struggle with the language around that, but something along those lines. Uncontroversial, I think, yeah. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that in this world that is not yet the finished new heavens and the new earth, those three virtues strain away from one another, and they can be in tension with one another. And I don't think this is controversial, but if you want an example, think about the recent conversations around peace in Ukraine. And peace could be brought to Ukraine today, but it would be at the cost of justice. And what really is that? What sort of peace is that really? You understand what I'm saying, I think. So I would suggest that in this world, before we reach the new heavens and the new earth, these virtues will tend to pull apart from one another. And I'd also suggest that any one of them inhabited in isolation from the others tends actually to a vice in the end. And I'll show you what I mean. Here we are. So I would suggest that the pursuit of peace, if it is followed with indifference to justice and holiness, it becomes, pusillanimity, or becomes sort of cowardly refusal to get involved, something like that. I would suggest that the pursuit of moral holiness in isolation from those other virtues becomes a sort of privatised piety that refuses to get its hands dirty or to get involved in the real world. And I would suggest that the pursuit of justice in isolation from the other virtues becomes sort of a utilitarian brute force which will enforce justice with violence. And therefore, if you're following me and if you're agreeing with me, they all need to be tempered by something. So peaceableness, the top left arrow, which can become pusillanimity, needs to be inhabited, needs to be followed with boldness in order to prevent it becoming a vice. That moral holiness, in order to avoid it becoming simply privatised piety, needs to be conducted, needs to be earthed with dirty hands. And that the pursuit of justice needs to be exercised with mercy. Are you following me? Okay. So my question then is, how do we, if these virtues strain apart from one another, how do we work out, let's go back a minute, how do we work out the balance when we are faced with a particular moral question? Do we go to war on this issue? Do we take up arms on that issue? Any particular moral question, and the church is always facing moral questions in every age, I think. How do we identify where the faithful spot is on that grid? And I would suggest that this faithful spot does not collapse to a pinpoint, not in this world. I think one day we'll be able to discover a place where those three things do not pull apart, and where we can find a sort of an operative place that does not compromise any of them. But I don't think we live in that world until the Lord Jesus returns. And so I would suggest that this is a kind of a circle which notionally encapsulates possible faithful responses. And you can see that it is not infinitely small. That clearly there are responses that we would say are not faithful, but that the area that encapsulates what is a faithful response is not vanishingly small. Does this make sense? And so I think it is the church's responsibility in every age to discern that, and to discern where, through the wisdom of the Spirit and in discernment with the community of God's people, where they are going to put their pin in their context, in their age. And it won't necessarily be the same as the previous generation put their pin, because there is not a single right answer to this complex question. Does that make sense? Interestingly, for me, this is the kind of the climax of my book. And interestingly, when I've had conversations around it, almost nobody's picked up on this. And they've talked about other things that I've written, but nobody's really picked up on this. Until I did an event a couple of weeks ago with military chaplains. And they were all like, oh, this makes sense. This is usable. So I was quite interested that it landed in that particular context. Anyway, that's by the by. Now then, I've got a few more minutes, and I want to present a few thoughts then about how we might resist the evil in our own hearts, and then how we as church might be resistant resist the violence in our own hearts, and how we as church might be resistant to violence more generally. So, some personal practices of resistance. And if disordered desire does indeed lie at the root of much violence, then reordering our desires would be a very sensible place to start as we address the seeds of violence in ourselves. And I invited you a moment ago to reflect on Genesis 1 to reflect on what the gospel has to say about this. But just to remind you on that question of the normality of violence, that even though violence is not woven into the structure of the universe, I hope I persuaded you of that Jesus, of course, in the Sermon on the Mount says, if you have ever had hatred, then you are a murderer in your heart. And so he says, I think, the seeds of violence lie within us all. So James writes these words that you're probably familiar with. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. And he basically sets out the beginning of Girard's thesis, I think. I'll put this little quotation up from my book, because even though I wrote it, I find this challenging. If we have never committed any great act of violence, it's not principally because we lack the tendency, I think. It's more likely because we have been blessed with a stable upbringing, with money to buy the things we need, with a life that is not threatened, with a home in a country at peace. Which isn't to say that everybody who lacks those things is violent, but that those of us who do not lack those things have not yet been tested, perhaps, about the extent of the violence that we are capable of. So how might we reorder our desires? Some thoughts about this. And one of them is learning to practice contentment and generosity, I think. You'll know the ways that the apostles promote contentment. Paul promotes contentment from his prison cell. And you'll know that, I haven't got time, but I'm sure you are very familiar with the whole concept of how generosity is woven through. I spoke a moment ago about creation as a cosmic act of generous hospitality. And so if violence is not woven into the fabric of the universe, generosity most certainly is. And so learning and leaning into contentment and learning generosity, which of course blesses us quite as much as it blesses the people we we are generous towards, because it sets us free from our own entrapment to possessions. That these are ways that we can gradually, by the work of the Spirit, reorder our desires. And I'd like to suggest the gift of Sabbath and Jubilee. Sabbath has had a really bad press for generations in the church. Maybe we're starting to reclaim it a little bit. But because Sabbath was enforced as a rule and was enforced kind of joylessly, so many of us have grown up in a tradition that has wholly rejected it. And it's such a shame, because Sabbath is a gift, which it was a gift to God's people who had been slaves in Egypt, who had never had a day off, who had never had the opportunity to down their tools and worship their God. And so the gift of Sabbath for them was absolutely, it was a weekly reminder that you are no longer slaves. And I could talk about Sabbath for a long while, but think about, so the people to whom Sabbath was given, or certainly the next generation or two, they were subsistence farmers. That's how most of them lived. They, what they harvested this year, they would eat next year, and they would plant next year, and there would be very little left over, and they didn't have money in the bank. So if you are a subsistence farmer and you see your harvest hanging on the vine or heavy in the ear, and it is Friday afternoon and the sun is going down, if you are going to observe Sabbath, you put your tools down and you sit on your hands for 24 hours. And that is a weekly reminder, and it's a very profound reminder that though the Lord uses your hard work to feed your family, that actually it does not entirely depend upon you. And there is something about receiving the gift of Sabbath that I think allows us to step out of the rat race, to put down our toxic ambitions and our toxic desires to acquire and to simply be. Which can help us to cultivate these virtues of contentment, generosity, and hence reordering our desires. And Jubilee, I'd love to talk about Jubilee for a long while. Jubilee, as I'm sure you know, was the 50th year after a Sabbath of Sabbath years, when slaves were when bonded labourers were set free, when land reverted to the family. Jubilee is told in ways that remind us of the story of creation. And that's because Jubilee was a great big reboot. And it wasn't just a reboot for the poor. It was a reboot for the rich as well. Because one of the things Jubilee did, if it was ever practiced, one of the things it was designed to do, was it prevent the rich from getting richer indefinitely and the poor and getting poorer indefinitely, because Jubilee would reset it. And so it was this grand reboot, and it set the wealthy free from the burden of their possessions. Some thoughts about how we might resist violence in our own hearts. But I'd like to just talk for the last 7 minutes, I think I've got, about some things that we can do as church to be agents of peace, prophets for peace, perhaps, in our generation. So a quotation from Philippians: "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life." And a quotation from a wonderful little book. And if you haven't got your Lent reading yet, or if you want something for Holy Week, then this little book by Jason Porterfield called Fight Like Jesus. And it's actually a journey through Holy Week. So it's got a chapter for each day of Holy Week. And I listened to it as an audio book, and I might return to it this Holy Week, actually. It's really profound. I highly recommend it. But he says this: on your own, all you can do is talk about peace and demand justice. But in community, you can actually embody peace and demonstrate justice. Your personal attempts to contend for peace will forever be stunted unless they are done as part of a community that endeavours to serve in this world as a living expression of that peace. Now, I don't think I need to persuade you. You're clearly people who are committed to your churches. So I'm not trying to persuade you of something that you don't already know, but to remember that what we are doing when we gather is more than the sum of the parts is no bad thing, I think. So I'd like to suggest, how many have I got? 4, is it? Practices 4 practices that we do or can do as church, which can help be that prophetic actor for peace in our generation. And I realise we don't normally think of existing as being a practice, but I want to say it anyway. So we speak quite a lot about Christian unity, and of course it's a very important theme, and I don't want to imply it isn't. But it is, in some senses, the call to Christianity is a call to the call to Christian unity is a call to water to be wet, because the church, by its very nature, is united. And anything that we are doing to fracture that does not actually change its status in God's eyes as united. Because the church is God's invention, not a human invention, and the church is united in his mind, in his heart, in his understanding of the church. I've got some friends who work on what's called the Ephesians 2 Gospel Project, and I think what they do is really remarkable. And they go into places of ethnic conflict, and they help church leaders to be promoters of peace in situations, some really unstable and dangerous situations in the world. And they do it out of deep study of Ephesians 2. Because we often think, well, maybe I don't want to speak for you, but I think Christians often think that what Jesus Christ achieves at the cross is a sort of vertical reconciliation of humans and God. And that because of that, now we need to be nice to people, and now we need to be peacemakers and so on. And actually, what Ephesians 2 shows is that what the cross achieves is vertical reconciliation and horizontal reconciliation. It's not an add-on, it's not an optional extra, it's not something we are then invoked to do. It is as fundamentally real as the vertical reconciliation. So the first part of Ephesians 2 speaks about reconciliation with God. Verses 11 and 12 speak about reconciliation between peoples who are in conflict. And then at the heart of the chapter, verses 8 to 10, speaks about salvation by faith for good works. And Werner Mischke, who from the Ephesians 2 Gospel Project, speaks about a conversation he had with a pastor in, I think it was Kenya, that was facing very substantial ethnic conflict in the area. And he spoke with the pastor and said, do you use Ephesians 2 in your church? And he said, absolutely, we've been using it for generations, and it's what has kept the church from getting involved in these conflicts. A very profound little story that he tells in his book. So that's the first thing, is understanding that the church is God's good idea, and that by the church's very existence, it is a testimony to the reconciling work of the cross. So let's never underestimate the significance of the church that we are part of. And I'm not talking just about local churches, of course. I'm talking about the transnational, trans-historical church. That is the true church. Second thing we can do, slightly more practical, I suppose, is practicing hospitality. But remembering that hospitality is quite complex. So I'm watching the time. That hospitality is quite complex, and that hospitality contains power structures within it. Because as soon as I say to somebody, step over the threshold to be welcome, I've said at the same time, this is my threshold, and I get to say who comes over it. And so that opens up, perhaps we'll have a conversation about this in a minute, about how we seek, if we seek to be multicultural church, how do we do that in ways that don't reinforce the power dynamics of insider and accepted outsider. Promoting reconciliation, practices that promote reconciliation. There's a wonderful book called Theology of Disagreement, I think it's called, Christopher Landau, and he speaks about the power of foot washing. Which is certainly not in the Baptist tradition that we do this, but he's Anglican. I'm not sure it's necessarily routine in the Anglican Church, but they do it a little bit more, perhaps. But he speaks about the power of foot washing as a way, as not just as a metaphorical thing, but actually as a very literal way of promoting reconciliation in situations of conflict. And finally, I want to just say about celebrating the Lord's Supper, and there is so much going on when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, and we can look at it from so many different lenses. But thinking about it as a peace meal, and let me just read you, if you don't mind, these words, and then I think I will close, or hand it over to you rather. So all participate in this covenant renewal on equal terms, just as we all enter the covenant on equal terms. All who partake must literally or figuratively kneel. We must acknowledge our own unworthiness and position ourselves as people under judgment and in need of mercy. We all eat and drink the same bread and wine. There is no budget version of the bread for some or luxury label of the wine for others. In eating of the one bread, we assert our essential unity. Apostle Paul tells us that. We line up side by side at the altar rail or sit cheek by jowl with people who irritate us, patronise us, let us down, and whom we have irritated, patronised or failed in our turn. We all suffer with the same affliction and must partake of the same cure. As we hold out our hands to be supplied with spiritual food, we acknowledge our dependence on our brothers and sisters and that we are a means of grace to one another. I'll skip on a bit. We share communion with those whose doctrines we disagree with and those whose worship styles bemuse us. Our participation in this meal resituates us in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church and reminds us we are all one. Taking communion is a radical act. It's an act of resistance, and it's an act that says the violence of this world is not normal, and we participate in the heavenly meal where all believers come together. That is where I will land. Can I invite you to take... Thank you.